Emma and I had been on the road for hours, and our excitement about the trip was still fresh. We'd left our small town early in the morning and had been driving through the vast, open landscapes of the American West. The scenery was beautiful, with wide plains stretching out as far as the eye could see and the occasional mountain rising in the distance. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, we were ready for a break. We had planned to find a small diner or gas station to stretch our legs and grab a bite to eat. As we drove along the main highway, the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the familiar sights of roadside businesses and signs had all started to blur together. That's when we saw it. A narrow road branching off from the main highway, barely visible in the growing darkness. There was no sign marking its beginning, no indication of where it might lead. The road looked almost hidden, swallowed by the surrounding landscape. It seemed like a shortcut or perhaps a scenic route that could take us away from the monotony of the main road. "Should we check it out?" Emma asked, her curiosity piqued by the unusual sight. I glanced at the road, feeling a mix of excitement and hesitation. Why not? It might be a nice change of pace. We made the turn, leaving the familiar highway behind and driving onto the unmarked road. The pavement quickly gave way to gravel, and the darkness seemed to close in around us. The headlights of our car cut through the thickening shadows, revealing a winding path ahead. The road was narrow, flanked by tall, dense trees that blocked out much of the remaining light from the setting sun. As we continued, the road began to twist and turn, the gentle curves growing sharper and more frequent. The feeling of isolation was palpable. There were no other cars, no signs of civilization, just the quiet hum of our engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Emma and I exchanged a look of nervous excitement. The road was mysterious and a little unnerving, but we were eager to see where it might lead. Little did we know, this unexpected turn would take us into a situation far more unsettling than we had ever imagined. The moment we left the main highway and turned onto the unmarked road, the world outside our car transformed. The highway's broad lanes and bright lights faded quickly, replaced by a narrow, winding path that seemed to carve its way through the dense forest. The transition was almost surreal. The first thing we noticed was how abruptly the pavement changed to gravel. The smooth surface of the highway gave way to a rough, uneven track that made the car jostle with each bump and dip. Emma and I exchanged glances, her eyes wide with curiosity and mine reflecting a mix of excitement and apprehension. The headlights of our car pierced through the encroaching darkness, revealing a road that seemed to stretch on indefinitely. Tall trees lined both sides of the road, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers trying to grasp at us. The canopy overhead was thick, blocking most of the remaining light from the setting sun. This created an eerie twilight, where shadows danced and twisted with every flicker of the headlights. The forest seemed alive, whispering secrets through the rustling leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. "Wow, this place is really secluded," Emma remarked, her voice tinged with both awe and unease. She adjusted her seatbelt and peered out the window, trying to catch a glimpse of anything that might give us more information about where we were heading. "I know," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "It's like we've stepped into another world. I wonder where this road goes." As we drove deeper, the road began to twist more sharply, and the trees grew denser. It felt as though the forest was closing in around us, the path becoming narrower and the shadows darker. The road itself was uneven, with potholes and loose gravel making the car sway and bump along. It wasn't the smooth drive we had been expecting, but rather a rugged, adventurous detour. "There's something kind of creepy about this place," Emma said, her voice a little shaky. "I mean, look at all these trees. It's like they're watching us." I nodded, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. "Yeah, it does feel a bit isolated. But think of it as part of the adventure. We're exploring something new, right?" Emma gave me a small smile, though her eyes still darted around nervously. "I guess you're right. Let's see where this leads. The further we went, the more the road seemed to take on a life of its own. It wound through the forest, and the trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches scratching against the car. The headlights cast long, eerie shadows that shifted with every turn, creating a play of light and dark that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. Every so often, we would pass a faded road sign or a discarded object, an old tire, a rusted can, but there were no signs indicating where this road might lead or how long it would continue. It was as if the road had been forgotten by everyone but us. "I don't see any signs or landmarks," Emma said, trying to peer through the windshield. "Are we even on a real road? This feels like we're in the middle of nowhere." "It's definitely not on any map," I said, glancing at my phone. "But that's part of the adventure, isn't it? Just a little detour." We continued driving, the sense of isolation growing stronger with each mile. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, and the darkness deepened, making it difficult to see beyond the immediate range of our headlights. The road twisted and turned, sometimes so sharply that I had to slow down to navigate safely. As we rounded a particularly sharp curve, Emma let out a soft gasp. "Look at that." I turned my gaze to the side of the road and saw what had caught her attention. There, half hidden by the dense underbrush, was a dilapidated wooden signpost. It was weather-beaten and barely legible, but I could make out the words, "Private Property," and "No Trespassing." The sign was old and worn, as if it had been there for years, forgotten and neglected. "That's a bit unsettling," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Doesn't it seem odd that there's a sign like that here? I thought this was just a random road." "It is strange," I agreed, my unease growing. "Maybe it's just an old sign that's been here for a long time." We drove on, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The forest around us seemed to grow darker and more oppressive, and the road continued to twist and wind, each turn revealing more of the same eerie, shadowy landscape. "I'm starting to think this wasn't such a good idea," Emma said, her voice trembling slightly. "Maybe we should turn back." I could hear the worry in her voice and felt a pang of doubt myself. The adventure was starting to feel more like a mistake. "Let's just keep going a little longer," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "We might find something interesting or a place to turn around soon." The road ahead looked even more foreboding, with the trees pressing in closer and the shadows growing deeper. Emma shifted nervously in her seat, and I could tell she was feeling the same sense of unease that I was. The adventure had taken on a darker tone, and the mysterious path we were following seemed to be leading us into something unknown and unsettling. We continued down the road, hoping for a sign that would tell us it was okay to keep going, or that would offer us an easy way out. But the deeper we went, the more it felt like we were driving into a place where time and reality had somehow been distorted, and the road was becoming more than just a path, it was becoming a gateway to something far more unsettling than we could have ever imagined. As we continued down the narrow, unmarked road, the sense of unease grew stronger with each passing moment. The forest around us seemed to close in tighter, and the atmosphere took on an increasingly eerie quality. The trees, tall and gnarled, reached out with their twisted branches, casting long, sinister shadows that danced in the flickering light of our headlights. It was as though the forest was alive, and every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig sounded like whispers and warnings from unseen entities. The shadows on the road twisted and turned with every movement, creating an unsettling play of light and dark that made it hard to focus on any one thing. The air inside the car grew colder despite the fact that the windows were rolled up. The temperature drop was subtle but noticeable, sending a shiver down my spine. Emma pulled her jacket tighter around herself, her breath forming small, visible puffs in the dim light of the car. I noticed her hand gripping the armrest tightly, her knuckles white with tension. We passed by strange landmarks that seemed out of place, an old, broken-down fence barely visible through the underbrush, its wooden slats rotting and leaning at odd angles. Nearby, a dilapidated shed stood in the shadows, its door hanging ajar as if it had been abandoned hastily. The shed's roof was sagging, and the walls were covered in moss and creeping vines. It looked like something straight out of a ghost story, a remnant of a past that had long been forgotten. The road itself was in disrepair, with deep potholes and patches of loose gravel that caused the car to bounce and sway. The constant jostling only added to the discomfort, making every bump feel like a jarring interruption to our growing sense of dread. The headlights barely penetrated the thick darkness ahead, casting only a narrow beam that seemed to struggle against the oppressive blackness of the forest. Every so often, we would encounter peculiar objects on the roadside, discarded toys, weather-beaten and faded, lying in the dirt as if dropped in a hurry. An old, rusted bicycle was propped up against a tree, its wheels half buried in the undergrowth. These items, so out of place in this isolated setting, seemed to belong to a world that had long since moved on, leaving only their remnants behind. The sounds around us were equally disturbing. The forest was alive with the noises of insects and the occasional distant hoot of an owl, but there were also unsettling sounds, creaks and groans from the trees, as if they were whispering secrets to each other. The occasional snap of a twig or rustle in the bushes seemed to be magnified in the quiet of the car, each noise sending a jolt of anxiety through both of us. "Do you hear that?" Emma's voice broke the silence, her tone barely concealing her fear. "It sounds like someone's walking behind us." I turned down the volume of the radio, trying to listen. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible over the hum of the engine, but it was there, an irregular, crunching sound that seemed to follow us, growing louder for brief moments before fading away again. I glanced nervously at the rear-view mirror, but there was nothing to see except the ever-deepening darkness behind us. The car's interior light flickered intermittently, adding to the sense of instability. The flickering cast erratic shadows on our faces, making our expressions look distorted and eerie. Emma's eyes darted nervously around, and I could see the fear etched into her features. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze fixed on the dark road ahead, trying to avoid looking at the unsettling sights outside. Every time I turned the wheel, it felt like we were being pulled deeper into an unknown, unsettling place. The winding road seemed to lead us further into the heart of the forest, and the growing darkness made it hard to distinguish between the road and the surrounding trees. The oppressive atmosphere made it feel like the forest was closing in, squeezing us into a tighter and tighter grip. The car's headlights revealed more of the same, shadowy trees, abandoned structures, and eerie remnants of a world that seemed to have been left behind. The road ahead was a never-ending ribbon of darkness, and the sense of isolation grew stronger with every mile we traveled. Emma's unease was palpable. "I think we should turn around," she said, her voice trembling. "This place is really starting to freak me out." I nodded in agreement, though I was reluctant to admit it. The sense of foreboding was hard to ignore, and the longer we stayed on this road, the more intense the feeling of dread became. "I agree. Let's find a place to turn around." But even as we decided to turn back, the road ahead seemed to shift and change. The darkness seemed to swirl around us, making it hard to see any clear path. The forest, once a simple backdrop, now seemed to be actively pushing back, its shadows stretching out like grasping hands trying to pull us further into the unknown. The sense of unease only intensified as we continued to navigate the winding road, the darkness growing ever deeper. It was as if the forest itself was alive, reacting to our presence with a growing sense of hostility. Each twist and turn felt like a step further into a realm where reality was distorted and time seemed to stand still. As we drove on, the oppressive atmosphere pressed down on us, making it clear that this was no ordinary road. The unsettling sights and sounds around us created an atmosphere of dread, and it was impossible to shake the feeling that we were venturing into a place where danger lurked just beyond the edge of our vision. As we drove deeper into the darkness, the unsettling atmosphere grew heavier, and our unease was further compounded by the strange and frightening discoveries we began to make along the road. It started with small, seemingly insignificant details that quickly escalated into more disturbing findings. The first unusual sight was a collection of old, tattered photographs pinned to the trees lining the road. The photos were yellowed with age and weather-beaten, their edges curling up in the damp, musty air. Each photo depicted various scenes of families and individuals, their smiles frozen in time. But something about these photos was off. Some faces were scratched out or had bizarre, red scribbles over them. One photo showed a young girl, her eyes crossed out with thick, dark lines, while another showed a family with their faces distorted into grotesque caricatures. Emma's hand flew to her mouth in shock. "What is this? Why would someone put these here?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I glanced at the photographs as we passed, feeling a shiver run down my spine. The unsettling images seemed to mock us, their presence adding to the growing sense of dread. A little further down the road, we came across an old, rusted car abandoned on the roadside. Its tires were flat, and the paint was chipped and faded. The car looked like it had been left there for years, but what made it particularly eerie was the fact that the interior was filled with strange objects. Through the cracked windows, I could see a collection of worn-out stuffed animals and old, dusty dolls arranged in a meticulous pattern on the seats. Their glassy eyes stared out at us, unblinking and unsettling. The sight of the abandoned car, with its bizarre contents, only deepened the sense of unease. As we continued, we noticed something even more disturbing: makeshift markers and strange symbols painted on the road. They were crude and haphazard, drawn in white paint or chalk. Some of the symbols were simple shapes, like circles and triangles, while others were more complex, resembling strange runes or patterns that made no sense to us. One particularly ominous symbol was a large, red circle with a black cross through it, painted directly in our path. It looked freshly painted, the red still bright and glaring against the dark asphalt. Emma stared at the symbols with wide eyes. "What do you think these mean? Are they some kind of warning?" I shook my head, feeling a growing sense of alarm. "I don't know, but it's definitely not normal. We should be careful." Our concern only grew as we drove past a dilapidated wooden sign leaning precariously to one side. It was barely visible in the dim light of our headlights, but through the gloom, we could make out some faded, handwritten words: "Turn back before it's too late." The sign's message was eerie enough on its own, but what made it even more unsettling was the fact that it was surrounded by what looked like a makeshift shrine. Scattered around the base of the sign were strange items: broken pieces of jewelry, half-burnt candles, and faded photographs of people we didn't recognize. It was as if someone had created a shrine to ward off intruders or to mark this place as something forbidden. We drove on, our tension mounting with each strange discovery. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, and every turn revealed new, unsettling sights. At one point, we came across a series of small, dilapidated huts clustered together in a clearing. They looked like they had been abandoned for years, their walls covered in graffiti and their roofs sagging. The huts were surrounded by what looked like old, discarded furniture and other debris, creating a scene of desolation and decay. One hut, in particular, caught my attention. It had a small window that was still intact, and through the grimy glass, I could see what appeared to be a collection of bizarre, handcrafted dolls. They were arranged in a circle on the floor, their faces painted with strange symbols and expressions that seemed almost alive. The sight of the dolls, their eyes staring out from the darkness, was enough to make my skin crawl. As we pressed on, the discoveries became more and more unsettling. We encountered more abandoned vehicles, their interiors filled with strange objects and oddments. We saw more disturbing symbols painted on the road, and the eerie markers became increasingly frequent. The entire landscape seemed to be a chaotic blend of the bizarre and the frightening, each discovery adding to the growing sense of dread. The final, and perhaps most unsettling, discovery came as we rounded a sharp bend in the road. There, lying in the middle of the road, was a large, old-fashioned trunk. It was battered and weathered, its metal clasps rusted and broken. The trunk was open, and inside, we could see a collection of old, dusty books and faded, yellowed documents. Atop the pile of papers was a single, handwritten note, scrawled in a hasty, erratic script: "Beware the path you choose. It leads only to darkness." Emma and I exchanged a glance, our fear palpable. The trunk's contents, combined with the ominous note, seemed to confirm our worst fears about this road. We were venturing into a place that was not only unknown but possibly dangerous. With each strange and frightening discovery, our sense of unease grew, and the feeling that we should turn back became almost overwhelming. The road ahead was becoming increasingly ominous, and the strange findings along the way seemed to be warning us of something we couldn't quite understand but clearly needed to avoid. The road, already fraught with eerie discoveries, took an even more sinister turn when we encountered a presence that none of us had anticipated. The uneasy quiet of the road had been interrupted by the unsettling discovery of strange symbols and abandoned items, but what came next was something far more alarming and direct. As we continued driving, the road seemed to grow narrower and the trees on either side began to close in, creating a tunnel of shadows that obscured our view. The air inside the car grew heavy, and every creak of the RV felt amplified in the oppressive silence. Emma and I exchanged nervous glances, our earlier unease now evolving into a palpable fear. It was then that we saw something ahead that made us both gasp. The headlights of the RV revealed a figure standing in the middle of the road. The figure was dressed in what looked like old, worn-out clothing that hung loosely from its frame. Its face was obscured by a hood, and it held a lantern that cast an eerie, flickering light across the road. The figure's posture was stiff and unnatural, and it seemed to be waiting for us. I slowed the RV, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. Emma's hand gripped the armrest tightly, her knuckles white. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, my heart pounding. "But we need to be careful." The figure remained motionless as we approached, its lantern casting long, dancing shadows across the road. As we got closer, I could make out the faint outline of a face beneath the hood. It was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. The figure's gaze was fixed on us, and its presence felt both unsettling and commanding. I stopped the RV a few yards away from the figure, and the air inside the vehicle seemed to grow colder. The figure made no move to acknowledge us, its lantern still casting its unsettling glow. Emma and I sat in silence, unsure of what to do next. After what felt like an eternity, the figure finally spoke, its voice low and gravelly. "You shouldn't be here." The words sent a shiver down my spine. The figure's voice was strange, almost otherworldly, and it carried an undertone of menace. "We were just following the road," I called out, trying to sound calm. The figure took a step forward, and the lantern's light revealed more of its face. Its eyes were dark and sunken, and its expression was one of deep sadness mixed with anger. "This road leads to danger," the figure said. "You must turn back before it's too late." Emma's hand tightened around mine. "What danger?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What's down this road?" The figure's expression hardened, and it shook its head slowly. "You will find out soon enough. The path you're on is not meant for those who seek safety." Before we could ask more questions, the figure turned and began to walk away, its lantern swinging back and forth in the darkness. The shadows seemed to swallow its form, and within moments, it had disappeared into the gloom. Emma and I sat in stunned silence, processing what had just happened. The figure's warning hung heavily in the air, and its presence left us feeling more unsettled than ever. The road ahead seemed even more menacing now, and the figure's warning seemed to echo in our minds. "What should we do?" Emma asked, her voice shaky. "I don't know," I admitted. "But we need to decide quickly. If we keep going, we don't know what we might encounter next." I looked at the road ahead, the darkness seeming to press in on us from all sides. The strange discoveries we had made so far were unsettling, but the encounter with the figure had added a new layer of fear to our journey. The warning had been clear, and its message was troubling. "We should consider turning back," I said, my voice firm. "The figure said this road leads to danger. We need to be cautious." Emma nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "I agree. We should get out of here before things get worse." With a heavy heart, I put the RV in reverse and slowly began to turn around. The darkness seemed to close in around us as we retraced our path, the unsettling feeling of being watched growing stronger with every passing moment. The road, once a strange and eerie place, now felt like a place we needed to escape from as quickly as possible. As we drove away, the memory of the figure and its ominous warning remained fresh in our minds. The road was still shrouded in darkness, and the sense of foreboding seemed to linger, a reminder of the unknown dangers that lay ahead. We were relieved to leave that place behind, but the encounter had left a lasting impression, and the fear of what might be lurking in the shadows stayed with us as we continued our journey. As we drove away from the ominous figure and its unsettling warning, the sense of relief was short-lived. The darkness of the road seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive, and an eerie stillness enveloped the RV. The oppressive quiet was only broken by the occasional creak of the vehicle and the low hum of the engine. The air felt heavier, more suffocating, and the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe in the headlights' glow. Emma and I exchanged anxious glances, both of us silently questioning our decision to continue. The figure's warning about the road leading to danger seemed to resonate in our minds, amplifying our fears with each passing mile. The path behind us was swallowed by the darkness, and the weight of the unknown seemed to press down on us more intensely. The RV's headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the further we drove, the more it felt like we were venturing into an abyss. The trees on either side were closer now, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, casting elongated shadows that danced in the flickering light. The oppressive gloom made it difficult to gauge how far we had traveled, and the tunnel of trees seemed endless. "I can't shake the feeling that something is following us," Emma said, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. Her words only served to heighten my own growing unease. "Don't worry," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "It's probably just the atmosphere playing tricks on us." But even as I spoke, I couldn't deny the growing sense of dread that was gnawing at me. The warning from the figure had struck a chord, and every sound, every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat. Suddenly, the RV's headlights flickered, and the engine sputtered as if it were struggling to maintain power. The vehicle jolted forward, causing us both to tense up. I glanced at the dashboard, where the fuel gauge showed a healthy level, but the engine seemed to be losing its power. "Not now," I muttered under my breath, trying to keep the vehicle steady. I could feel my pulse quickening as the engine coughed and spluttered. Emma looked at me with wide eyes. "Is something wrong?" "I'm not sure," I replied, my voice strained. "It might be a malfunction. Let's just try to get through this." I eased off the accelerator and tried to maintain a slow, steady pace. The road seemed to narrow even more, and the trees loomed closer, their dark silhouettes pressing in on us. The oppressive darkness made it hard to see what was ahead, and every turn seemed to bring more uncertainty. Just as I thought things couldn't get worse, a series of loud, rhythmic banging noises began to echo from the back of the RV. The sound was disorienting and seemed to come from within the walls of the vehicle. Emma's face went pale, and she clutched my arm tightly. "What's that noise?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, trying to sound calm. "I'll check it out." I pulled over to the side of the road, the RV coming to a halt with a shudder. The banging continued, growing louder and more insistent. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the cold air hitting me like a slap. The darkness outside was even more oppressive than inside, and the beam of the flashlight barely cut through the thick gloom. I walked to the rear of the RV, the banging growing more frantic. I shone the flashlight at the back, but I couldn't see anything unusual. The noise seemed to be coming from within the walls, but there were no visible signs of damage or disturbance. "What's going on?" Emma called out from inside the RV. Her voice was tinged with panic. I don't know, I replied. But I don't see anything out here. Maybe it's just a loose panel or something. I started to head back to the driver's side when the banging suddenly stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The sudden quiet was just as unsettling as the noise had been, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I quickly returned to the RV, locking the door behind me. What did you find? Emma asked, her eyes wide with fear. Nothing, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But the noise has stopped. Let's just get moving. I started the engine again, and we continued down the road, the shadows closing in around us. The tension in the RV was palpable, and every sound seemed magnified in the oppressive silence. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every mile. The temperature inside the RV dropped suddenly, and we could see our breath misting in the air. Emma shivered and wrapped her arms around herself, her fear evident. Eric, this isn't right. We need to get out of here. I know, I said, trying to stay calm. But we need to keep going. We don't know what's ahead or what we might encounter if we turn back. The road ahead was still cloaked in darkness, and the trees seemed to press in closer. The shadows appeared to move and shift, creating the illusion of movement in the periphery of our vision. The oppressive atmosphere made it feel like we were being enveloped by an unseen force. Without warning, a strange, high-pitched whine began to fill the air. It was a sound unlike anything I had ever heard, a piercing noise that seemed to come from all directions. The RV's lights flickered erratically, and the engine sputtered again, causing us both to flinch. What is that? Emma cried out, covering her ears. I don't know, I shouted back. But it's getting louder. The whine grew louder and more intense, creating a disorienting and maddening effect. I struggled to keep the RV on the road, my hands shaking as I fought to maintain control. The darkness seemed to close in around us, and the shadows appeared to writhe and dance with malevolent intent. Suddenly, the high-pitched whine stopped, replaced by a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to come from beneath the road. The ground beneath the RV trembled, and a series of vibrations shook the vehicle. The road ahead seemed to shift and warp, as if it were being reshaped by some unseen force. Eric, what's happening? Emma's voice was filled with terror. I don't know, I said, my own fear rising. But we need to get out of here now. The RV's headlights illuminated a patch of road ahead that was completely different from the rest. The asphalt was cracked and uneven, and the once dark trees had been replaced by twisted, gnarled shapes that seemed to reach out like clawed hands. The atmosphere was charged with a palpable sense of danger, and every instinct told me to get away. I accelerated, trying to escape the nightmarish scene. The vibrations beneath the RV intensified, and the road seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. The feeling of being pursued grew stronger, and the oppressive atmosphere made it feel like we were being hunted by something beyond our comprehension. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the road began to straighten out, and the oppressive atmosphere started to lift. The vibration subsided, and the darkness seemed to recede slightly. The high-pitched whine had disappeared, leaving behind an eerie, unsettling silence. We drove on in tense silence, the fear of what we had just experienced still lingering. The road ahead seemed to return to normal, but the encounter had left us both shaken and fearful of what might come next. We were acutely aware of the dangers that lay ahead and the need to stay vigilant as we continued down this perilous path. As the night wore on, the oppressive feeling slowly began to lift, but the memory of the escalating danger remained fresh in our minds. We knew that whatever we had encountered was still out there, waiting, and that the road ahead was fraught with unknown perils. The journey had become a test of our courage and determination, and we could only hope that we would make it through safely. The night was wearing thin, but the danger still felt as real as ever. Emma and I were trapped in a nightmare of our own making, and the only option left was to escape. The road ahead, while seemingly normal again, felt treacherous and unpredictable. The recent events had shattered any sense of safety we might have had, and desperation set in. "Eric, we need to get out of here," Emma said, her voice trembling. Her eyes darted nervously around the dimly lit interior of the RV. "This place feels wrong. I don't think we should stay on this road any longer." "I agree," I replied, my own fear mirroring hers. "But turning around might be just as dangerous. We need to find a way to get out of this mess." The tension between us was palpable. We had no idea what dangers awaited if we continued or if we went back. Our only choice seemed to be to keep moving forward while remaining vigilant. I glanced at the GPS, which was still struggling to find a signal, and then at the road ahead. The darkness was still thick, but there were no obvious signs of the previous disturbances. I pushed the RV to a faster speed, hoping to make as much distance as possible before something else went wrong. But it wasn't long before we encountered our first obstacle. The road began to narrow again, and the trees on either side grew denser, their branches clawing at the sides of the RV as if trying to drag us into the woods. "Eric, be careful," Emma warned, her voice strained. "The trees are getting closer." I swerved slightly to avoid the encroaching branches, but the RV's side mirrors scraped against the trees, making a nerve-wracking screech. I could see the branches bending and twisting as if they had a life of their own, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. The road was becoming a tunnel of darkness, and the branches seemed to close in tighter with every passing moment. As we navigated through the increasingly narrow path, another problem arose. The RV's headlights began to flicker again, and the engine sputtered, causing the vehicle to jolt and lose power. I felt a surge of panic as the engine groaned and then went silent. The RV rolled to a stop, leaving us in a suffocating silence. "What's wrong?" Emma asked, her voice tight with fear. "Why did the engine die?" "I don't know," I said, trying to stay calm as I tried to restart the engine. My fingers trembled on the ignition, but the engine refused to turn over. Something must be wrong with the fuel system. I got out of the RV to inspect the engine, hoping it was something minor I could fix. The engine compartment was dark, and the faint light from the flashlight I carried barely illuminated the area. I checked the fuel lines and connections, but everything seemed intact. My frustration grew as I realized that there was no immediate solution to the problem. "We can't stay here," Emma said, her voice cracking. "We need to keep moving." "I know," I said, feeling the weight of her words. "Let's try to get the engine started again. If that doesn't work, we might have to find another way out." I climbed back into the driver's seat and tried to restart the engine once more, but it remained dead. We were stuck, and the oppressive darkness seemed to close in around us. The road seemed to grow even more sinister, with the trees casting long, menacing shadows that danced in the dim light. "We can't just sit here," Emma said urgently. "What if something comes after us?" I nodded, feeling the same sense of urgency. "All right. We need to think of something else. Let's check the surroundings and see if there's another way out." We grabbed our flashlights and stepped outside the RV. The darkness outside was even more daunting, with the shadows playing tricks on our eyes. The road ahead was still shrouded in gloom, and the trees seemed to close in even tighter. As we walked along the road, we stumbled upon another unexpected obstacle. A massive fallen tree blocked our path, its trunk and branches creating an impenetrable barrier. We tried to push and maneuver around it, but it was no use. The tree was too large and heavy to move, and the road beyond was still obscured by darkness. "This is getting worse," Emma said, her voice filled with frustration. "What are we going to do?" I could only offer a helpless shrug. "We need to find another way out. We can't stay here and wait for something to happen." Our search for an alternative route took us deeper into the woods, where the trees seemed to press in even more tightly. The shadows were thicker, and the atmosphere felt heavier with every step. The air was damp and cold, and the sounds of the forest seemed to amplify the eerie silence. Eventually, we came across a small, overgrown path that seemed to lead away from the main road. It was narrow and barely visible, but it was our only option. We decided to take it, hoping it might lead us to safety. The path was rough and uneven, with roots and rocks jutting out, making it difficult to navigate. The darkness made it hard to see where we were going, and every sound seemed magnified in the oppressive silence. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and the shadows seemed to move and shift with a life of their own. Despite the obstacles, we pressed on, driven by the need to escape the looming threat. The path seemed to wind endlessly, and the oppressive atmosphere made it feel like we were walking in circles. Our progress was slow, and exhaustion began to set in. Just when we thought we couldn't go any further, we saw a faint light in the distance. It was a small, dim glow that seemed to offer a glimmer of hope. We quickened our pace, eager to reach the source of the light and find a way out. As we approached, the light revealed itself to be a small cabin nestled among the trees. The sight of it was both reassuring and unsettling. The cabin was old and weathered, with its windows dark and uninviting. It seemed to be abandoned, but it was a potential shelter from the dangers we had faced. We cautiously approached the cabin, our hearts pounding with a mix of hope and apprehension. The door creaked as we pushed it open, revealing a dark and dusty interior. We stepped inside, grateful for a brief respite from the darkness outside. But as we looked around, the sense of unease returned. The cabin was eerily quiet, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. It was clear that we had found a temporary refuge, but the danger was far from over. We knew that whatever threats had followed us on the road were still out there, waiting. Our escape was only a temporary measure, and the real challenge would be finding a way out of this nightmare for good. The cabin, while a temporary sanctuary, did little to ease the gnawing dread that had taken hold of us. Emma and I huddled together in the dim light of our flashlights, the oppressive silence of the cabin only amplifying the fear that churned within us. Our minds raced with thoughts of the dangers we had narrowly escaped and the ominous threat that still loomed. As we settled into a tense silence, the sound of the wind outside grew louder, howling through the trees with a haunting intensity. The cabin's walls creaked under the strain of the wind, and every small noise seemed magnified in the stillness. The flickering light of our flashlights cast eerie shadows that danced across the walls, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. Emma's voice broke the silence, her whisper barely audible over the howling wind. "Eric, do you think we're safe here?" "I don't know," I admitted, my own fear evident in my voice. "But it's the best we have right now. Let's just stay alert and keep an eye out." We tried to make ourselves as comfortable as possible, but every creak of the cabin and every gust of wind made it clear that we were not alone. The sense of being watched was almost palpable, and every small sound outside the cabin made us jump. We checked the windows, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing but the oppressive blackness of the forest. Hours passed in this uneasy vigil. Just when it seemed that our nerves might finally settle, a new sound pierced the night, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps approaching the cabin. My heart skipped a beat as I grabbed my flashlight and turned it toward the door. Emma's eyes widened in terror as she clutched my arm, her grip tight and anxious. "Someone's coming," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do we do?" "We need to stay quiet and be ready," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rising panic. "We don't know who or what's out there." The footsteps grew closer, the sound growing louder and more deliberate. The noise was accompanied by a faint rustling, as if something, or someone, was moving through the underbrush. The sound of the footsteps stopped right outside the cabin, and a heavy silence fell over us. We held our breath, waiting for the next sound. The door creaked open slowly, and a shadow fell across the threshold. I could barely make out the figure of a person standing there, their features obscured by the darkness. The figure did not move or make a sound, but the mere presence of it was enough to send a chill down my spine. "Eric, what do we do?" Emma's voice was barely more than a whisper, her fear evident. "We need to see who or what it is," I said, my voice resolute. "But we have to be careful." I edged closer to the door, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I slowly stepped forward and shone the light towards the figure. The beam revealed a face, but it was not a person I recognized. The figure was gaunt and pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. The eyes were devoid of emotion, their gaze unsettlingly empty. The figure didn't move or speak, but its presence was enough to make my blood run cold. The air around us grew colder, and the wind outside seemed to intensify, howling through the trees with a renewed fury. "What do you want?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear that gripped me. The figure did not respond. Instead, it raised a hand slowly, pointing towards the forest. The gesture was slow and deliberate, and the emptiness of its eyes seemed to convey a silent warning. Emma and I exchanged worried glances. The figure's presence and its eerie silence suggested that it was not a simple encounter but something far more sinister. We had to make a decision quickly. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice urgent. "We need to find another way out. But we have to be cautious." We gathered our things quickly, our movements hurried and frantic. The figure outside remained still, its gaze fixed on us as we prepared to leave the cabin. The wind howled louder, and the atmosphere seemed to thicken with a sense of impending doom. As we stepped outside, the cold air hit us like a wall, and the darkness of the forest seemed even more impenetrable. The figure's presence still loomed, its silent watchful eyes tracking our movements. We pushed forward, our footsteps crunching on the underbrush as we made our way through the dense forest. The feeling of being followed was almost overwhelming. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig seemed to signal an unseen presence lurking behind us. The forest felt like a living entity, its shadows and sounds conspiring to make us feel vulnerable and exposed. Our path through the forest was fraught with obstacles. The ground was uneven and treacherous, with roots and rocks threatening to trip us. The darkness made it difficult to see, and every step felt like a step deeper into the unknown. Just when it seemed that our escape might be impossible, we spotted a faint light in the distance. It was a welcome sight, a beacon of hope amidst the oppressive darkness. We pushed ourselves harder, desperate to reach the source of the light and find safety. As we neared the light, we realized it was coming from a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an old, dilapidated signpost, its words barely visible. The sign seemed to mark the end of our journey through the forest. We approached the signpost, the light revealing a message etched into the wood. It read, "Welcome to the end of the road." The message was unsettling, and the realization that our journey might be reaching its climax added to the tension that gripped us. The forest seemed to close in around us, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. We had reached the end of the road, but the true nature of the threat was still unknown. The night was still young, and the darkness held many secrets yet to be revealed. The small clearing where the signpost stood was eerily quiet, the oppressive silence only broken by our heavy breaths and the distant howl of the wind. Emma and I exchanged nervous glances, the fear in our eyes mirroring the desperation we both felt. The sign reading, "Welcome to the end of the road," seemed more a taunt than a promise of safety. We knew that getting out of this situation alive depended on our next moves. "Look for any sign of a road or path," I urged, my voice tight with anxiety. "We need to get out of here before whatever is following us catches up." We searched the clearing with frantic urgency, the faint light of our flashlights revealing nothing more than the overgrown grass and the rotting wood of the signpost. The dense forest surrounding us was still and uninviting, offering no clear escape route. Emma's flashlight flickered as she scanned the area. "Eric, over here," she called out, her voice carrying a note of hope. I hurried over to where Emma stood, her flashlight illuminating a narrow, overgrown path leading deeper into the forest. The path seemed to offer a potential escape, though it was choked with brambles and tangled roots. "It's our best chance," I said, grabbing Emma's hand. "Let's move quickly." We plunged into the path, the underbrush tearing at our clothes as we pushed forward. The dense forest swallowed us, the darkness pressing in on all sides. Every step felt like a step into an unknown abyss, the feeling of being watched never leaving us. The sound of rustling leaves and snapping branches grew louder, and the ominous sense of an unseen presence grew stronger. It felt as though something was moving behind us, its movements deliberately slow and menacing. Our pace quickened, driven by the fear that whatever was following us might be closing in. Suddenly, a sharp cry pierced the air. Emma stumbled, her flashlight beam faltering as she fell to the ground. I turned, my heart racing as I saw a dark figure emerging from the shadows. The figure's presence was even more unsettling up close, its hollow eyes and gaunt face making it clear that this was no ordinary threat. "Emma, get up!" I shouted, panic rising in my voice. I reached out to help her, but the figure's gaze was fixed on me, its expression one of cold determination. Emma scrambled to her feet, her face pale with fear. "We need to go, Eric," she cried, her voice shaking. We continued down the path, the figure's presence growing more intense. The darkness around us seemed to close in, and the sounds of the forest seemed to amplify, creating a cacophony of unsettling noises. Our escape route was fraught with obstacles, fallen branches, tangled vines, and the uneven terrain made it difficult to move quickly. The figure behind us seemed to grow closer, its footsteps echoing our own. The sense of impending danger was palpable, and every noise, every rustle of the leaves, seemed to signal its approach. We reached a small stream that crossed the path, the water rushing past with a cold, clear sound. The stream offered a brief respite from the relentless pursuit, and we paused to catch our breath. The figure's presence seemed to falter momentarily, the sound of its footsteps growing fainter. "This might buy us some time," I said, my voice breathless. "Let's move quickly but quietly. We don't know how long we have." We crossed the stream carefully, our feet slipping on the wet rocks. The cold water splashed around our ankles, adding to the discomfort of our escape. The sound of the stream masked the sounds of the forest, but it also made it harder to hear any approaching danger. As we emerged from the other side of the stream, the path ahead seemed to widen slightly. The forest appeared less dense, offering a clearer view of the surroundings. The feeling of being watched persisted, but the immediate danger seemed to have receded. We continued along the path, our pace slowing as we tried to regain our composure. The fear of being pursued was still present, but the immediate threat had lessened. We kept our flashlights on, scanning the area for any sign of danger. After what felt like hours, we finally reached a small, paved road that intersected with the path. The sight of the road was a welcome relief, a symbol of our escape from the forest's grasp. We stepped onto the road, our exhaustion evident in our every movement. Emma collapsed onto the pavement, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. "I think we're safe," she said, her voice weak but relieved. "We made it," I said, sitting down beside her. "But we need to stay alert. We don't know if the danger is truly gone." As we rested, the sounds of the forest seemed to fade, replaced by the distant hum of traffic. The road offered a sense of safety that the forest had not, and the feeling of being watched slowly dissipated. The immediate danger had passed, but the memory of our harrowing escape would stay with us for a long time. We knew that we had narrowly escaped a terrifying ordeal, and the night's events had left us shaken but grateful to be alive. As we caught our breaths and took in our surroundings, we resolved to never let our guard down again and to always be wary of the unknown paths that might lie ahead. As the dawn broke, casting a pale light over the forest and the small paved road we had stumbled onto, a fragile sense of relief washed over us. The night's horrors seemed to retreat with the shadows, replaced by the tranquil morning stillness. But as the sunlight pierced through the trees, the memories of the past hours clung to us like a persistent fog. Emma and I sat on the roadside, the adrenaline from our escape slowly fading, replaced by an aching exhaustion. We looked at each other, our faces reflecting the same unsettled thoughts. What if it's not over? Emma's voice trembled, breaking the silence. What if that thing is still out there? Her words sent a shiver down my spine. Despite our escape, the feeling of being pursued never fully left us. We were no longer in immediate danger, but the unsettling sense of dread lingered, a constant reminder of the night's events. Maybe it's just the aftermath of the fear, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We've escaped the immediate threat. That's what matters. Yet, as we waited for help to arrive, our eyes constantly scanned the surrounding woods, half expecting the dark figure to reappear. The forest seemed quieter now, the sounds of the night having given way to the morning chorus of birds. But the quiet was not comforting, it was eerie, almost unnatural in its stillness. Our phones, which had been out of signal in the forest, finally picked up a weak signal. I made a call to the authorities, reporting the strange events and requesting assistance. But as we recounted our story, I couldn't shake the feeling that something crucial was being left unsaid. The waiting seemed endless, the shadows of the forest stretching long into the morning. When the rescue team finally arrived, their presence was a welcome relief, yet their arrival only seemed to underscore the unresolved nature of our ordeal. They searched the forest but found no trace of the dark figure or any other signs of danger. It was as if the forest had swallowed the evidence of our terrifying experience. As we were driven away from the scene, I glanced back at the forest, its towering trees now seeming almost to close in on us. The road we had followed was now just a memory, an unremarkable path that had led us into the heart of our fear. The unease I felt was not just about what we had encountered but also about the possibility that it might not have been the end. Weeks later, as we tried to return to our normal lives, the shadows of the forest continued to haunt us. Emma and I spoke frequently about the events of that night, trying to make sense of the experience. The lingering questions and the eerie sense of being watched never fully faded. We occasionally revisited the area, hoping to find some explanation or closure. Each time, the forest seemed more indifferent, its silence taunting us with the unknown. We never encountered the dark figure again, but the fear of its return was always present. The road we had once thought was our escape route had become a symbol of unresolved terror. It represented not just our narrow escape but also the unsettling truth that some dangers remain hidden, lurking just beyond the edges of our understanding. In the end, the lasting terror was not just from what we had faced but from the uncertainty of what might still be out there, waiting in the darkness. The experience had changed us, leaving a mark that time could not erase. The fear that had gripped us that night continued to linger, a constant reminder that some mysteries are never fully resolved and that the shadows of our past can cast long and chilling echoes into our future.